So today we will be talking about concept of buildings to grid ecosystem and some innovative solutions for enabling the interactions between buildings and the grid, but also interactions with some other distributed energy resources. This is just a reminder that energy efficiency in Southeast Asia, as we're focusing on this region, is extremely important to mitigate the expected growth of energy demand. The region is growing rapidly, and we're expecting that energy consumption is going to grow substantially by the mid-century. And as you can see, both equipment efficiency and buildings efficiency can help to substantially reduce energy demand and associated greenhouse gas emissions. Cooling, we talked about cooling quite a bit on day one. It's one of the fastest growing end uses in the region, especially in the residential sector. It is also driving the increase in peak demand quite substantially. And through efficiency, but also as we'll talk about more through flexibility and digitalization, we can reduce and shift the peak demand so that we don't have to increase the investments in supporting energy infrastructure. So just putting some learnings together from 2 previous days. On day 1, we really focused on buildings, and my colleague Ian guided us through different energy efficiency measures in terms of buildings design, and also we looked at smart solutions for optimizing buildings operation. Yesterday, we talked about smart grid and what are the enablers for a smart grid. And Pauline was talking about potential for flexibility and what kind of benefits it can bring to both users and the energy system overall. So today we will be talking about the interaction between the two. And I think we both all agree that digitalization is what enables the integration between buildings and the grid. B2G, as we call it, building to grid ecosystem, can really help buildings to reduce both energy consumption, but also associated costs through optimization of use of energy resources, but it can also deliver benefits to the grid through reducing the pressure on the grid, congestion of energy resources, through more flexible grid operations. If we look at the typical electricity market, electricity system in ASEAN region, we typically look at how it historically was at the vertical integration of generation, transmission, and distribution up to the point of consumption. It is has been quite heavily regulated by the government through national power companies who are serving the whole electric power flow. In some countries, the process of deregulation has started several decades ago, and independent power producers entered the market to offer their services and also meet the increasing electricity demand. So this is quite common in many Southeast Asian states, this kind of picture. But what we're talking about is to increasing the flexibility of both the grid side and also the flexibility of demand. So we're looking at introducing distributed energy resources to the mix, which will definitely increase the complexity. As you know, distributed energy resources, and we talked about it on previous days, can be really anything that can deliver grid services. We're talking about distributed generation, for example, through rooftop and buildings, behind the meter storage, smart charging, and electric vehicles. We'll have a deep dive presentation specifically on that today. And of course, demand response. So when we introduce this to the electricity market, we're really looking at quite a complex picture, which requires a lot of effort to make sure that we're managing them well. When we look at buildings becoming distributed energy resource, we really need to think of how it can shift from being an isolated energy consumer, just quite sad picture. We can see the guy is pretty upset with his energy bill because he will have to pay for all the energy he consumes, towards becoming energy prosumers. And this is really a building which can both consume and produce energy on site and deliver benefits to both end users and the grid. As we can see, the lady on the picture is pretty happy about it. So there are different models of prosumers. This is just a schematic example from a very interesting report by Smarten. You can find it in supplementary readings, which clearly shows that through both starting from self-consumption, satisfying the self-consumption through on-site generation, but also delivering it to the grid, the building as prosumer, as distributed energy resource can deliver a number of grid services. And we talked about them quite a bit on day one, so I'm not going to go into details, but of course, we always start with efficiency first to reduce the load, energy load from buildings onto the grid, but also through other grid services include shedding the load, so temporarily reducing the use and shifting the load towards, for example, in response to signals from the grid towards, for example, times of when energy is the cleanest or the cheapest or both. And we'll hear more about this real-time interaction between buildings and the grid in Craig's presentation, which will follow. Also modulation and of course generation of renewable energy as we discussed. So these grid services are a really important part of interaction between buildings and the grid. And yesterday we already started talking about interaction when we dove into the examples of peer-to-peer electricity trading. And there was an interesting question in the chat: what will happen if all buildings become prosumers instead of being consumers, whom we're going to sell this in excess electricity which they produce? And it's a very valid question, and many countries battling with excess renewable energy after it increases up to a certain threshold in electricity mix at certain times of the day where, for example, solar energy is abundant, or we have a lot of wind, for example. And that brings us to the issue of curtailment, which I think came up yesterday as well, especially in some breakout sessions. And it's quite a sad problem, and it's not insignificant at the global level. So as you can see from some data over the course just 7 years, at the global level, we curtailed the equivalent of annual electricity demand of Spain, which is not a small country. And if we think about it, it's really the cleanest energy we are all craving for, but we have to reject it because the grid cannot absorb it, just because we didn't manage it well and it was produced at a certain time of the day. So what can we do to manage distributed energy resources better? Well, the first step is always we can't manage what we can't measure, and we measure through meters. So smart meters is really the first step for understanding behind the meter energy demand and starting collecting the real data, more granular data from all these distributed energy devices. As you can see, we have already quite some smart meters installed at the global level. This is from a very recent OECD report on interoperability, which was published actually during this week. You can also find it in supplementary readings. Have a look. So this data shows the installed smart meters by region, and we can see in Asia Pacific in absolute numbers that's quite substantial, and we're expecting the growth over the course of the next decade, which is a great indicator. Unfortunately, smart meter is not the only solution, and it's not going to be enough to ensure the interaction between buildings and the grid. What we really need is to ensure that two-way communication between distributed energy resources and the grid is efficient and as flawless as possible. So we're really talking not only about interaction between buildings and the grid, but electric vehicles and the grid, and vehicles and buildings, and many other devices and smart equipment. The equipment is becoming smarter and smarter, so we need to make sure that this smartness is shared across all distributed devices. So, and that brings us to the question of interoperability, how we can make sure that these devices can communicate to each other and to a broader energy systems. When the question of interoperability comes into picture, we often talk about need to develop standards to facilitate this communication and eventually to facilitate data exchange and response from different devices to signals from other devices or from bigger electricity system. So when it comes to buildings, there are obviously some physical systems in place. We have devices and equipment installed inside the buildings, like smart thermostats, smart meters, smart water heaters. There are some standards already in place, for example, in the US, which can help these devices to communicate directly to the grid and respond to its signals, for example, reduce consumption or reduce temperature at certain times of the day, depending on the tariff or depending on electricity mix, depending on the program. Also, the building automated systems and smart home energy management systems can provide capability to integrate different devices and the communication between different devices within this system and facilitate the communication to the grid. And there are other standards, for example, open standards like open ADR and smart grid standards by IEEE, which is in the process of facilitating this standardization of communication. However, the use of those standards is still quite limited and fragmented, and we still face a lot of challenges in terms of data being closed, unavailable, proprietary protocols instead of open source protocols, which can be used by everyone. So there is still a lot of improvement which need to be made in this area. When we can enable the communication between different distributed energy resources, buildings included, and the grid, what we can also do is the next step is to bundle them together into a single entity. And that brings us to the concept of virtual power plant. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, but here you can see schematically how it basically looks like. It's a digital platform which functions almost as a physical power plant because it can aggregate supply from different distributed energy resources, which are producing, for example, renewable energy or other energy resources, and provide it to consumers in optimized manner. There are some good examples of virtual power plants already, and the largest one is, for example, in Australia, in South Australia, which was implemented through Tesla solar plus storage technology, and it's already has been documented that this kind of aggregator or virtual power plant can deliver substantial power demand reduction, but also savings for consumers. For this kind of power plants, virtual power plants to work, we need proper regulatory framework. And I think we started talking about regulations quite a bit yesterday, and we will continue discussion on policies today. We also need advanced metering infrastructure, as we talked about, in order to collect data, ensure real-time communication between virtual power plant and distributed energy resources, and advanced forecasting to make sure that we have techniques to predict very accurately renewable energy power generation, as well as a load in the power system. Another benefit which this two-way communication can bring, as we also discussed yesterday, is peer-to-peer electricity trading. And I think we had a great presentation with many examples yesterday, which clearly explain how this can work. So I'm not going to go into details, and you're all familiar with the interaction between consumers and prosumers based on those examples. The interesting fact is also that peer-to-peer electricity trading platform can serve as virtual power plant as well. And we will hear more about another example from the region, from Thailand in Yelena's presentation today, which is the largest, as of now, the largest peer-to-peer trading platform in the world. It also implemented regulatory sandbox. As we heard from Hoyen's presentation yesterday, the regulatory sandbox was used in pilot in Malaysia. The same is in Thailand. And it's a very interesting concept for policymakers, which really help them in a safe place to test some of the innovative solutions, let's say, without necessarily changing upfront the whole regulation. So certain regulatory limitations and rules can be changed within this one pilot project. So just I'm going to quickly run through a couple of examples and hand over to our deep dive speakers. But as I said, for example, in just to give you an example that this kind of two-way communication is getting into some of the policies already, which is important. Today we'll talk a lot about policies. So just to give you an idea, for example, in the United States, Washington State passed a bill to ensure that certain electric storage water heaters are using specific modular communication interface or protocol, which can allow two-way communication and automated demand response. So I think it's a very good example how this flexibility and communication between device and the electricity grid can already be embedded into regulatory policies. Another interesting example, again, from United States, from California building standards. This state has a long history of quite effective building regulations with documented benefits for consumers, but also substantial reduction in energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. This year, they updated the regulation to really focus on all electric construction and really prepare buildings to be electric ready. There are electric ready requirements. And in one of our upcoming presentations, we will talk about making buildings digital ready. So that's already a step towards it. But very interestingly, there are also requirements to install demand response automation technology for some of the key equipment and devices. So we can see how this flexibility aspect is getting into energy efficiency regulation for buildings already in some places. So just coming to the end of my presentation, I want to leave you with an idea which we at IEA really working a lot on. It's the idea of policy packages. So we already started talking in breakout groups yesterday. I heard some people were talking about need for change in regulation, more incentives, awareness raising campaigns came up to raise the awareness about the issues of energy efficiency and flexibility, both for policymakers, but also for the public to understand the benefits. So really, we need a combination of regulatory information instruments and incentives to make it work. And just some key takeaways, what kind of maybe policies we can look at in order to enable this interaction between buildings and the grid, aggregation, peer-to-peer, energy trading. Of course, we need to help distributed energy resources enter electricity market and aggregators of them to participate in the market. Establish data collection, cybersecurity, and privacy rules around it. Support smart meters rollout as the first step, as we discussed, towards making it more transparent and enabling this data exchange. Regulatory sandboxes as a good first step to help policymakers to be more comfortable with innovation. And of course, empowering prosumers and allowing them to trade between each other, but also to communicate with the grid and respond to its signals. So I will stop here with my presentation.